In this part, we'll look at a maintenance procedure for tilting pad thrust bearings. We'll see how to take a thrust reading, and we'll see how to disassemble, inspect, and reassemble a thrust bearing. This water feed pump contains a journal bearing and 2 thrust bearings. There's an inboard thrust bearing and an outboard thrust bearing. The thrust bearings are mounted on either side of a thrust collar. Each thrust bearing assembly includes thrust shoes and an upper and lower support bracket. The pump has been locked and tagged out according to company procedures. It has also been drained of fluid. Typically, the first step in thrust bearing maintenance is to take a thrust reading to measure total clearance. The total clearance for a thrust bearing is the amount of thrust collar movement that is allowed by the thrust shoes and the support brackets. Thrust readings can be taken with feeler gauges or wedge gauges, but these mechanics will use a dial indicator. One mechanic removes an access plug from the end plate of the housing and sets up the dial indicator to contact the end of the shaft. He secures the dial indicator to the end plate so that it will not slip as the reading is taken. When the dial indicator is in position, the other mechanic moves the shaft as far as it will go in one direction. The dial indicator is then set to 0. Next, the mechanic moves the shaft as far as it will go in the opposite direction, and the thrust reading is taken. The value shown on the dial indicator is compared with the value given in the manufacturer's specifications. If the reading on the dial indicator is higher than the total clearance specified by the manufacturer, the clearance is excessive and maintenance is required. To check the reading, the mechanic moves the shaft back in the other direction to see if the dial indicator returns to 0. If the dial indicator does not return to 0, the indicator may have slipped and the reading should be taken again. Worn-out thrust shoes are a common cause of excessive clearance in a thrust bearing. However, the only way to determine the exact cause of the excessive clearance is to disassemble the bearing and inspect the shoes. Before starting the disassembly, the mechanic cleans the outside of the bearing housing to lessen the chance of dirt or grit getting into the bearing and causing damage. The mechanic removes the end plate and the housing bolts and guide pins. He then removes the top half of the bearing housing. The outboard thrust bearing is removed first. The mechanic begins by removing the thrust shoes. The thrust shoes are placed on a clean work surface to prevent them from collecting dirt. Then the support brackets are removed. They are also placed on a clean work surface. Once the outboard thrust bearing is completely removed, the process is repeated to remove the inboard thrust bearing. After both thrust bearings are removed, the next step is to inspect the thrust collar. The mechanic inspects the thrust shoes next. He removes each shoe from the outboard bearing and carefully inspects it for signs of excessive wear. If any shoe in this type of bearing shows signs of excessive wear, the entire set of shoes must be replaced. If only 1 or 2 shoes were replaced, the new shoes would be thicker than the old shoes and more load would be placed on the thicker new shoes. As a result, the new shoes would wear out more rapidly than they would if the whole set were replaced. The thrust shoes in this bearing are in good condition. They show no signs of excessive wear, so they will not be replaced. After checking the shoes, the mechanic is careful to replace them in their original positions. The mechanic checks the thrust shoes and the inboard bearing in the same way. Now let's watch the mechanic reassemble the bearing. The inboard bearing is installed first. The mechanic starts by installing the inboard support brackets on the shaft. Next, the mechanic carefully installs the thrust shoes in their original order. Then the mechanic positions the inboard bearing with the locking pin groove at the top. Next, the outboard bearing support brackets and thrust shoes are installed. To make sure that the bearing components won't slide off the shaft, the mechanic carefully holds the support brackets in place as he installs the thrust shoes. When the outboard bearing is completely assembled, The mechanic rotates the outboard bearing until the locking pin groove is properly aligned with the groove on the inboard bearing. The locking pin grooves must be positioned properly to allow the locking pins to fit into the grooves when the bearing housing is installed. The locking pins hold the thrust bearings in place so that they don't spin with the shaft. Finally, the bearing housing is reassembled. The upper half of the housing is put in position. The bearing housing bolts are installed next, and then the guide pins that align the housing are tapped into place. Following company procedures, the mechanic tightens the bolts in a specific pattern to ensure that they are tightened evenly.